5. Read verses 1 through verse 12. We begin reading with verse 1. And seeing the multitudes, he went up into a mountain. And when he was set, his disciples came unto him. And he opened his mouth and taught them, the disciples, in the hearing of the multitudes, saying, Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are they which do hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Blessed are they which are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are ye when men shall revile you and persecute you, and shall say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice, be exceeding glad, for great is your reward in heaven, for so persecuted they the prophets which were before you. To speak tonight, and be a few parts to this, the personality of the Sermon on the Mount life. To live the life that we are called to live requires certain characteristics, and those are listed here in these verses. Again, Jesus is speaking to the disciples in the hearing of the multitudes. The Sermon on the Mount is part of Christ's intensive training of his own in discipleship. And in this portion of the sermon, there are very definite characteristics that the saved are to possess. Better said, characteristics that are to possess them. In other words, this is who we are to be. So these characteristics are seen in the words that follow, Blessed are thee, blessed are they. And what follows is very specific characteristics. And as we've already seen, these characteristics are marked by blessedness. That is, a happiness, a joy, a peace, an assurance, a satisfaction and delight. And all of this is deep and abiding. And this becomes another characteristic. So you have all these characteristics, and each one is marked by that word blessed, which becomes another characteristic. And though there is a very specific and definite sequence in these characteristics and how they are presented, they're not a program whereby we become recipients of God's blessings, and we must not view them in that way. But they are a description. They are a description of the individual who can live the life presented in the Sermon on the Mount. They are of extreme importance, and they are foundational to the life that is presented. We have to have these if we're going to live the life, if we're going to have the attitude that is presented throughout the Sermon on the Mount. So they are a description of the individual who can live this life. Now, these characteristics that Christ is presenting are beyond mere surface, beyond formality. They're not something that you can just decide to do. They are a declaration. They are an illustration of the persons we need to be if we're going to live the life that is presented. These characteristics, verse 3, self-poverty. In verse 4, it says, "Blessed are they that mourn," and what that is a longing for help, for God's help. And then verse 5, there's meekness. Verse 6, there's spiritual hunger and thirst. Verse 7, there's mercy. Verse 8, there's purity of heart. Verse 9, there's peacemakers. Verse 10, there are those who are willing to suffer for the sake of righteousness. So all of these characteristics, every single one of them, are contrary to the ways and values of the world, which is the place where we are to display these characteristics. Each of these are contrary to superficial religion that marked Christ's day and that marks ours as well. Each of these characteristics are contrary to our natural temperament, contrary to our natural tendencies. Every one of them. Everything about these characteristics is the opposite of the wisdom and so-called common sense of the world and the natural mind. These characteristics show us that there is a radical difference between saved and unsaved, both in person and in practice. They are a revelation of what Jesus so plainly stated in John chapter 18, verse 36, "My kingdom is not of this world. My kingdom is not from hence." It is a kingdom not originated or propagated in the earthly, in the temporal. And so it is with these characteristics as well. They do not originate with us. They are not propagated by us. They are not produced by us. They are not artificially produced. They are the result of a miraculous transformation from God that takes place in salvation, and God continuing to work in the heart of the child of God. I believe they are an absolute necessity, an indispensable necessity to the life that is being presented. You cannot live the Christian life without these. They are indispensable, absolute necessity. We see that they declare the type of person we need to be. They declare the life that we are to live as well. So in this opening section of the sermon, the essence of authentic Christianity is presented in these characteristics known as the Beatitudes. That's not what they're called in Scripture, but that's what they're known as, and nothing wrong with that. But they need to be who we are. And that's how they're presented. Blessed are the poor in spirit. That's who they are. Blessed are they that mourn. Blessed are the meek. It's who they are. It's their life. So, let's, first of all, verse 3. We need to be a people of poverty in spirit. It says, blessed are the poor in spirit. Spirit is a very important word here. It's not blessed are the poor. It's blessed are the poor in spirit. It's a spiritual state. What is the spiritual state? Poverty in spirit. And again, there's a very precise sequence here. The order is very important. And this is in the forefront. Poverty in spirit. That's where we must begin with God. Poverty in spirit. That's the starting point. That's the starting point with God. With us before God. The starting point is not what we have. It's what we don't have. Poverty in spirit. Poor. To be poor conveys the idea of lack. Conveys the idea of need. It speaks of emptiness. It speaks of nothingness. And this is where we must begin with God. We're nothing. And we have need of everything that He is. That's where we begin. You can't begin anywhere else. If you think you begin with what you have, then it's of you. That's works. No, we must begin with what we don't have. We're poor. We're poor in spirit. And this is why so many who profess salvation never even come close to living the Christian life, never come close to living the life that is presented here, because they're not poor in spirit. And that's where it has to start. That's where it has to start. So many of God's people are trying to impress God with who they are. Poor in spirit. We have nothing. We have nothing. To be poor in spirit, it's not the same as humility. Most make it the same here, but it's not. And we'll get to that later. But the poor in spirit, humility flows from poverty of spirit. Poor in spirit is to have a vivid realization, first of all, of our own personal sin and our unworthiness. And that will cause you to be humble. Poor in spirit, a vivid realization of our own personal sin, and therefore we're unworthy. We have nothing. We have nothing. The poor in spirit have a vivid realization that in and of themselves, in and of ourselves, we have no spiritual assets. We have nothing to bring or offer to God. Therefore, the result of that is you become humble. But as long as we think we have something to offer, We have something to bring to the table in and of ourselves. That's not poverty of spirit. To be poor in spirit is to have the realization that in and of ourselves we can do nothing. That's poor in spirit. The result of that, when you realize that without God you can't do anything, that will humble you. But it's first poverty of spirit. The realization. It's the realization of John 15:5. Without me ye can do nothing. It is what Paul said in 2 Corinthians 3 verse 5, not sufficient in ourselves. Not sufficient in ourselves. We're poor. Poor in spirit is to have a vivid realization that in and of ourselves, because we're poor, that we have a great need, which we cannot provide. Therefore, again, 2 Corinthians 3:5, not sufficient in ourselves, our sufficiency is of God. So poverty of spirit is we realize that we have nothing to offer. Nothing to offer to God in and of ourselves. It is the realization that we can do nothing. Why is it that so many of God's people, they're trying so hard, or at least they say they are? Stop. Just stop. You can't do it. You need poverty of spirit, the realization, I can't do this. Which causes us to realize we need Him. So this poverty of spirit is what David confessed of himself in Psalm 40 verse 17, in Psalm 70 verse 5, in Psalm 86 verse 1, in Psalm 109 verse 22, I am poor and needy. Two things there. It's not one and the same, though they're vitally connected. I am poor and needy. So he had come to know, he had come to understand, he had come to believe about himself. I'm poor and needy. He is saying that in and of himself, he was spiritually impoverished, spiritually destitute, in and of himself unacceptable, deficient, and weak. And because of that, I'm needy. I'm needy. I am poor and needy. So you have two things. You have the state, poor. And you have the condition, the result of the state, needy. That's what it is to be poor in spirit. David is saying, this is who and what I am in and of myself. It's what Paul said in Romans 7 verse 18. Oh, I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing. That is in my flesh, that's in and of ourselves, dwelleth no good thing. That's what poverty of spirit is. There aren't many that believe that. Very few. There's very few that are poor in spirit. Very few believe there's nothing in me that's good. In our flesh. Nothing. Nothing at all. Therefore, you have nothing to offer. You have nothing to commend yourself to God. In and of yourself, we have no spiritual assets. It is the realization that because of what I am, in and of myself, I need God. I need God. That's what it is to be poor in spirit. I need God. And I have nothing to offer. It's a spiritual sensitivity. So this poverty of spirit is a felt, not just verbalized, it is a felt emptiness in and of ourselves. And this is where we must begin, with God. Again, we do not begin bringing something to God. You begin with God having nothing to offer. It is a poverty of spirit that makes us aware of our personal need, of His grace, and of His mercy. And again, this is where we begin, with God. And this is where we begin with this life that is being presented. So it is this poverty of spirit that I believe the prodigal son was brought to. In Luke 15, verse 17, and when he came to himself. What that means is he came to the end of himself. He had nothing. He had nothing. He was poor in spirit. He's empty, nothing to offer. I believe it's also the publican in the parable. Luke 18:13 was brought to this poverty of spirit. Smote upon his breast and said, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. The Pharisee had what he thought he could bring to God. I pray, I fast. But the publican was poor in spirit. He had nothing. This is rare. Poverty of spirit is so rare. And that's why the Christian life is so rare. It's a necessity. I believe Paul manifested it. Philippians 3, verse 9. Not having mine own righteousness. Not having mine own righteousness. I'm bankrupt concerning mine own righteousness. It was for this lack of poverty of spirit that the Laodicean church received rebuke. Notice in Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3, verse 17. Because thou sayest, I am rich. Now that's pride. Because thou sayest, I am rich. It's also ignorance. And increased with goods, and have need of nothing. Okay, that's a lack of poverty of spirit. And knowest not that thou art wretched. To be poor in spirit is to know that in and of ourselves, wretched, miserable, poor, blind, naked, nothing to offer unto God. This poverty of spirit is recognizing and embracing our insufficiency and therefore our dependency upon God. This poverty of spirit, again, notice in verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. That can be looked at as a promise. It can be looked at as just a statement of fact. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It's present tense. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. The kingdom, of course, speaks of the government of heaven. These that are poor in spirit are fit right now for the government of heaven. How can we live this life that is being presented if we're not even fit for God's rule, God's government? Let's just be honest. Most who profess salvation, they're not in the least bit interested in God's government in their lives. It doesn't interest them at all. But if they were poor in spirit, and they realized, I have nothing, I need God, now they're fit and they're interested. So until poor in spirit, one is not ready or able to live their lives governed by God. And the life that's presented throughout the Sermon on the Mount is just that. It's a life governed by God. We submit to Him. So theirs is, present tense, the kingdom of heaven. A kingdom must have a ruler, must have a king. Jesus Christ is the king of this kingdom. And the poor in spirit are ready to recognize Him as their king and their master. How many who profess to be God's people are ready to recognize Him as king and master? They fall in the category, why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? Oh, it's easy to say, oh, He's my Lord, and then disobey. And that's why the Lord asks, why call ye me Lord, Lord, and do not the things which I say? But the poor in spirit are ready to be governed, ready to recognize the Lord is king. A king implies power. A king implies authority. And the poor in spirit are ready to recognize His power and His authority. The poor in spirit do not buck against the authority of the king. They don't argue against it. They submit. Again, a kingdom must have subjects. The poor in spirit desire to be His subjects. They desire to know His will because they're nothing. They are ready to submit to do His will. Many people claim they want to know God's will, but once you know it, do you submit to it? It's two parts, knowing and submitting. So this poverty of spirit is the basis. It is the foundation of everything that follows, of all the characteristics that follow. It is the priority. It is the key to everything. And you cannot just go home and say, I'm going to work on that. I'm going to be poor in spirit. That's not how it works. You have nothing. You have nothing. The very fact that you think you can make yourself become poor in spirit shows you're not poor in spirit. You have nothing. God has to do this work. So we need to ask God to cause us to be poor in spirit. That leads to the next thing, verse 4. Blessed are they that mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are they that mourn. I believe it's in line with blessed are the poor in spirit. Spiritual in nature. It's related to poor in spirit. And I believe it's the outflow of poor in spirit. The only ones, we can mourn about a lot of things, but that's not what this is talking about. It's not just talking about you had a bad day in your mourning. That's not what this is talking about. It's connected. It flows out of poor in spirit. I have nothing to bring to God in and of myself. That should produce mourning. That should produce a mourning. So, the only ones who can and will experience the mourning spoken of are the poor in spirit. The order or sequence of Christ that Christ presents here is poor in spirit, they that mourn. Poor in spirit, they that mourn. And this is the order that is presented in the Word of God as well, not just here. Notice in Psalm 34. Psalm 34, verse 18. The Lord is nigh unto them that are. So it's something they are. Not something they do. It's something they are. Of a broken heart. Of a broken heart. To be broken is to be disabled in ourselves. Disabled in ourselves. You break a bone, that bone is disabled. It's disabled in ourselves. It's the same as poor in spirit. Broken. Broken. And then notice, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit, which is the outflow of broken. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Psalm 51, verse 17. Notice the order. Broken, contrite. Psalm 51, verse 17. The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit. A broken spirit. A broken and a contrite heart. Order. Broken. Contrite. O God, thou wilt not despise. And then in Isaiah 66. Isaiah 66, verse 2. For all those things hath mine hand made, and all those things have been, saith the Lord. But to this man will I look, even to him that is poor, and of a contrite spirit. So he's talking about the spirit. I'm just talking about a material poverty that is poor and of a contrite spirit. Poor in spirit. And the order is poor and contrite. And this individual trembleth at my word. So to be broke, it's first broken, disabled in and of ourselves, and then it is contrite, which is a penitent one who is sorely grieved and deeply sorrowful for sins committed, or in the case of poverty of spirit, because they have nothing to offer to God in and of themselves. So the word translated mourn in Matthew 5, verse 4, is the Greek word pentheo. Pentheo. It means to grieve, to lament with passion. The picture is an individual reaching out to God. That's what the penitent do. They reach out to God for forgiveness. A broken and contrite spirit. Broken, realizes, I can't do anything to obtain forgiveness. And therefore I'm contrite. Reaching out to God. Reaching out to God. When one realizes that without God they can do nothing, they'll reach out to Him. That flows from poverty of spirit. So it is a reaching out to God for what we need, just as a poor beggar with nothing to offer. There's blind Bartimaeus on the side of the road, pleading with the passerbys. He has nothing to offer to any of them. He realizes what he is, and he's pleading. And that's what this is. It's a reaching out to God. It's a spiritual mourning that proceeds from the realization of our spiritual poverty in and of ourselves, and therefore that we are needy. And your degree of realization of neediness will determine the degree of how you reach out for God. So, they that mourn are those spoken of in 2 Corinthians 7, verses 9 and 10, who possessed a godly sorrow, and therefore they sought forgiveness from a godly sorrow, a true realization of what they had done and what they were. And that's what this blessed are they that mourn. It flows from the realization that I have nothing. I'm poor in spirit. Looking around at the religious world, and even our own fellowships, you can't possibly believe that the masses are reaching out to God. You can't possibly believe that. The evidence is not there. Why is that? Because we're not poor in spirit. Oh, we've been through this before. And this is what we did then, and we'll just do that now. You need poverty of spirit. I have nothing. So it's a sincere seeking of God's help as a result of poverty of spirit. When we're poor in spirit, there will be a sincere seeking of God's help. And if we're going to live the Christian life, and if we're going to live the life that's presented here, which is the Christian life, we need God's help. Because without Him, we can do nothing. And we have nothing to bring to the table. An earnest, personal pursuit of God is a result of poverty of spirit, and I believe is what this morning is all about. In poverty of spirit, there is the personal realization of an urgent need of God. Now, if you have an urgent need of God, you feel that, there will be an earnest pursuit of God. The two work together. Blessed are the poor in spirit, blessed are they that mourn. The promise or the fact is, they shall be comforted. This individual who realizes, I have nothing in and of myself, I am nothing in and of myself, this individual reaches out to God because they realize God is everything I need. God has everything I need. They shall be comforted. That is, they will find support and they will find strength. They will have spiritual rejuvenation. You follow these Beatitudes through, you have a picture of salvation. You have a picture of how God works in salvation. So blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they that mourn. They're one and the same. Same people. The mourning proceeds from the poor in spirit. So we need to be poor in spirit. We need to ask God to make us so. That causes us to realize our urgent need, which leads to a passionate pursuit of God. Again, these things are in a very definite order. It's not presented as a ladder to be the recipient of blessedness. They're just statements of fact. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are they that mourn. Who is it that mourns? The poor in spirit. Brother Ben, if you'll come, lead us in verse of song.